It's my pleasure to welcome Mary, who will take things from here.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And thank you all for being here today to discuss and to deconstruct a popular word that's probably often misused and probably has a different meaning to all of us. And so because of this, it's a hard topic to explore, but it is one that I think is important for us to do together as a community. I wanted to just share a few reflections before we begin. You know, when I first started planning for this talk, I was really caught up in how the original definition of resilience really didn't align with living with a loss like FTD and PPA. The Latin root of the word is to bounce back. And we know that in such a loss like this, there isn't a bouncing back. Life changes forever and you change forever. And so that definition felt really unrealistic for anyone experiencing a loss like FTD. And I also started to understand this other side to resilience, almost the shadow of resilience that really was suggesting that the responsibility to be resilient and to adjust fell on you alone. And this expectation that caregivers will just be resilient. And I really wondered, in preaching the importance of resilience, are we just putting more responsibility on all of you instead of sharing that responsibility of resilience? And the stress that would cause to feel even more responsible for one more thing. One woman I spoke with shared that to her, that word of resilience was really code for, I'm sorry to hear what you're going through, but you're on your own. And that is not a message that we want resilience to be giving. But changing this expectation of resilience is exactly why we're here today. And it's why the AFTD is fighting and advocating and creating supportive respite programs and supporting research every day to take this responsibility off of you to bear alone and to create a community of resilience alongside you. So after a lot of wrestling with this word, I've come to understand that even though its original meaning was to bounce back, the meaning has changed and the word itself has adapted. And today I want to continue to update it and adapt it together to give meaning to your experiences. And whether we call it resilience or fortitude or the purest form of love and devotion, I really want you to connect with the spirit of the word and really take pride in the courage you have to show up every day to support someone living with this illness. And so with that, I'll begin. I hope you have a lot of opinions about this word. And again, as Bridget said, I hope you'll share those thoughts in the chat as the talk goes on so that you can be connecting around this word. So these are the objectives that I have today. I really want to define and review the relevant research on resilience, redefine it to give meaning to the experience of caring for someone with FTD and PPA, understand a certain framework for rediscovering resiliency in uncertain times, and identify ways that help build resilience and adaptation in the face of loss, like FTD and PPA. And also, I really would like for all of you to share what helps you through the most difficult moments living with this disease. I also want to try to avoid buzzwords that I know you've probably heard a lot. And I don't want to give you more to do. I don't want to put more on you today. That's not what this is about. This is about giving you an understanding of the different intersections between loss and adaptation and coping in the brain. And again, a chance to acknowledge a deeper appreciation for yourself and this incredible love that you give. So why does this matter? Why are we talking about this? We know that the levels of economic and caregiver burden are very high in FTD. And until we have a cure, the care that you offer, the dignity you ensure, the safety you keep, and the ensuring a quality of life for the person is the treatment that we have. Dr. Powell talked about this in her book, Dementia Reimagined. But this is the treatment that we have. And we know that that care and that treatment comes from your own personal resources. And we know that these are not infinite. And if we look to what we know about resilience, it's believed that a resilient coping style can really diminish the stress and burden and promote adaptation. So we do want to integrate what we know about resilience to protect and prioritize your mental and spiritual and physical well-being. And it also matters because we need to broaden how we think about personal resilience to include living with FTD and PPA. And I think simultaneously challenge this notion that resilience is yours to build alone, that this really needs to be more of what a community is building together. So resilience in caregiving is thought to really be a capacity that we all have. It's within all of us. And it's really thought to be this ability to adapt in the face of tragedy, ongoing stress, even trauma. And it's believed that we use our emotional strengths to adapt. Resilience can be mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and exist in all these different ways. It's also believed that resilience is influenced by life events and resources available. So if you have lived through trauma before or ongoing stress before, that affects your sense of resilience. Also, if there are resources or not resources or there are not resources available, that is also going to affect our sense of resilience. It's believed that there are protective features that resilience has protective features to prevent against falling into poor physical and mental health. You know, an example of resilience that I think can resonate with everyone is this term, the new normal. Maybe you've discussed this in support groups that you've gone to or come across this term in your reading, but it really refers to how what was normal before is no more. And so you have had to adapt and organize your family differently around the different symptoms and around how everyone is responding to the illness and the different abilities and the different needs. And so this new normal that we talk about, this is an example of resilience and adaptation. I also want to point out how subjective resilience is and what a perception it is. It might be something that other people see in you and they comment on, or something you see in other people, but you might not see in yourself. And I think along those lines too, it's not something we either always feel or don't feel. We can sometimes feel resilient and then other times not feel resilient. There is an interesting study that asked caregivers to identify, do they feel resilient or not? And then also fill out some measures of resilience. And the findings on the measures were that people on scales scored higher on resilience measures, but did not feel resilient themselves. So how we're measuring this and how we're seeing it in ourselves is also, based on perception. So I also think it's important to identify what resilience is not. It is not a fixed personality trait. It is not a judgment of how well you're doing. And it is certainly not endless. Burnout, we talk about burnout in this work, and burnout occurs when people have been asked to do too much for too long with no relief in sight from that stress. And burnout is not a failure of resilience. It's in fact a consequence that we've been taking resilience for granted. We all need supports and resources to respond with resiliency. It's not something that we can be expected to find within us alone. So it is not this idea of we're going at it alone. It also doesn't mean that you don't experience difficulty and stress and grief and sadness. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're always keeping it together and you never fall apart. We know that sometimes we need to fall apart in order to come back together. It is also not ignoring what our body is telling us, ignoring exhaustion, ignoring depression or anxiety. And as I said earlier, it's certainly not a bouncing back to the way things were before. I wanted to share a little bit about the research and about what we believe are thought to be certain markers of resilience. as you can imagine, being so subjective, resilience is a difficult area to study because there are many variations of how people define it, and measuring it is also complicated. But there is a growing body of research around caregivers, especially with caregiving with dementia and resilience. And some of the findings stand out. And I wanted to share some of those with you. So in a research study where caregivers were asked to identify certain behaviors associated with resilience and associated with building strength in difficult times, some of the findings identified that having emotional and social supports was most likely to predict resilient coping. And so I've highlighted those here. So connecting with a community that supports you, connecting with emotional support for yourself, and really understanding what's happening for you emotionally so that you can access that type of support. An interesting finding in the research in one study I read was that some caregivers also recognize that the appearance of resilience to others might have a negative impact on them receiving help. So this fear that if I appear like everything is okay and I'm resilient, I won't be offered help. And I thought that was really striking to hear. And I share these other markers of resilience and these habits of resilience because I want you to also see the things that you are already doing and the traits that you already have and the things that are helping you maintain your well-being and reducing your vulnerability to stress. So if we were to think about specifically redefining resilience and adaptation in FTD and PPA, I think it would really be a story about managing and adapting and enduring so many painful paradox, this holding on while you're letting go, to feel heartbroken and yet painstakingly build a new day. You know, I know I don't need to remind you of some of these other things on the slide that you're doing, but I do want to reflect on the strength that you have found thus far in these very complex contradictions that you bear every day. A few that I will mention here on the slide. Enduring this very ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is a term that was first described by Pauline Boss, and I'll say a little bit more about her work later on. But she coined this term to describe this experience of someone being here physically but emotionally absent. And so there is no closure to the loss. It is ongoing, and it is it can leave us feeling stuck. Because there is so much uncertainty around what is lost and what remains. And another aspect of resilience that I think is so relevant to FTD and PPA is this bearing this anticipatory grief, knowing that there is further loss ahead in the future, and holding that even right now, even though those things haven't happened. I think resilience in FTD would also include knowing what you can give, and maybe sometimes finding resolve to go beyond that, but also knowing what your limits are and knowing when you can't go on and knowing when you can't do more. I think similarly, having the strength to fall apart and maybe sometimes coming back together, but also sometimes that being assigned to say, I just can't do this way. I can't do this alone anymore. I can't do this by myself anymore. I need more. So in her work around ambiguous loss, and in her book that's called Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief, Pauline Boss outlines this theory to help families recover their resilience. And I think that's a unique term, recovering resilience, that it is in there and we're just finding our way back to it. Recovering resilience in the face of uncertainty, and also finding some peace in this time while doing that. So I really do encourage you to read her work about ambiguous loss and loving someone with dementia, because you can go into more detail into some of these tasks and into some of these steps, but I thought I would just name a few today. One of these steps would be finding meaning. And in that, I mean, there is no meaning in this loss. This loss didn't happen for a reason at all. Meaning is what we do with the loss. Meaning is what we make of this time. And by naming the problem, naming the ambiguous loss, talking about it with other people, and using that very both and thinking that the relationship has changed and it still exists. Normalizing ambivalence or managing mixed emotions would be another one of these tasks. And it's really normalizing some of the anger and the guilt and the anxiety of all these mixed emotions, and maybe talking about them with a professional so that you can develop a tolerance for all of those powerful feelings. And really ending this absolute thinking that either someone is gone or they're still here, that it's both. Reconstructing or broadening the identity would include really understanding who you are now and really redefining family relationships and roles and boundaries, understanding how the relationship has changed and who you are to each other, if you're in a partnership or in a relationship, and understanding that you can be a caregiver and still have your own needs. Adjusting expectations would be really modifying this need to control, decreasing any kind of self-blame, and accepting what will not change. Really, so balancing our sense of control with our sense of acceptance. Rediscovering hope would include finding something else to control, to balance the ambiguity of this time, finding something else to feel there is hope in. And finally, holding on and letting go, really revising our attachments, seeing what you have already let go of, defining how the relationship has changed, recognizing that the person is both here and not here, grieving what you've lost and still seeing what remains, and also finding new connections with people who understand. So I would love to take a moment and go into the chat together to understand what comes up for you with this word resilience. We'll just take a little bit of time to do this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this word. Is it the right word? Is there another word that resonates with you? Do you find there's a disconnect between how resilient you feel and how resilient people might tell you are? So I would love to hear any reflections that you have, and we'll take a minute to do that. Adaptable, yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's too much to be resilient. Yes, I'm sure so many have heard, I don't know how you do it. Feeling both resilient and overwhelmed at the same time. It's not one or the other. Patience. Feeling it in your body. I experience it every day after a night's sleep. I feel my resilience. So feeling it as a physical sensation. The cost of resilience. Yes, that comes up. That's really important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. Can someone take care of me? Can I have a day off of resilience? This feeling that there is no peace to this pressure to be resilient. Well, I really would love to spend more time hearing these thoughts, and I really hope we can save this chat to continue this conversation. So thank you for everything that you shared. And keep going while I'm talking, okay? I really want it to be a place to connect. So I did want to acknowledge some other processes that are taking place as we search for deeper reserves of strength in ourselves, and talk about what's happening in the brain when faced with a great deal of uncertainty. We know that the brain is incredible, and it has helped us survive for forever, for as long as we've been around. But the brain also has this tendency to have a negative bias. So what this really means is that we tend to register negative things more readily, and we dwell on those events. And these negative things have a greater impact on us than positive experiences. So positive experiences go right through without much recognition, but we really lock into the memories of the negative experiences, and then we're searching for the next negative experience. Similarly, criticisms have greater impact than compliments do. And this is just part of the brain. The brain also loves to tell stories, and the brain also loves to judge ourselves and judge other people. So when I say tell stories, I mean telling ourselves something like, oh, he never listens to me, or if I were resilient, I wouldn't feel so overwhelmed. Just these kind of narratives we have that aren't really based in fact, they're just based in our perception. And so I'm going to talk about just catching those sometimes, because they can have a really negative effect on our sense of ourselves and how we're doing and our worth and our self-esteem. And maybe you've heard of this before, but the cognitive model of the brain would say that our negative thoughts contribute to negative feelings. So if we have a lot of negative thoughts and we're telling ourselves these negative judgments and these negative stories, that is going to impact our mood in a negative way. Another element that impacts our sense of strength and resilience is stress. And these are just things I want you to be aware of, because I hear so much from family members, I can't concentrate, and I'm so irritable, and I'm so forgetful. What's wrong with me? And this is something that just happens when we are stressed, when that fight or flight is activated. And these are some things that are generated in that experience. And I don't want you to criticize yourself for these things. I just want you to see them and be aware of them, that this is what happens when we are experiencing a great deal of stress. But the good news is that we can balance that negative bias and that stress. And one of those ways is to hunt for the good. Intentionally look for what's going okay. There's an exercise called 3 wins, but it doesn't have to be 3. It could just be thinking of one thing that day that went okay, no matter how small. But we have to force ourselves to look for what's also going okay. Giving equal weight to things that didn't go wrong. There's also a thought that experiencing positive emotions can buffer us from that low mood and those more depressed feelings. Also, by being aware of the stories that you're telling yourself, of that negative self-talk, of that criticism, it's something that seems to be so subconscious that we're not even aware of, but to bring some awareness to how hard we are on ourselves and any stories that we're telling ourselves that might not be serving us in this time. And maybe reframing some of those stories. We know they're based in perception. So maybe if some of the negative thoughts would include, I'm not good at this. Reframing that thought would be, I'm doing the best I can right now in this really difficult time. Also, in terms of balancing the stress, we know that when stress is activated and when that fight or flight is activated, we can bring ourselves down and ground ourselves again with the simplest forms And so even if it's 1 or 2 deep breaths, just to activate that relaxation response in you, to activate that parasympathetic nervous system that tells your body that you're okay and you're not in danger. So even if it's just 1 or 2 deep breaths, to have a relaxation response and to practice it when you don't need it. So to make it familiar. And so in times when you do need it, it's there. So in response to stress, focusing on where you do have control. What is one thing that I can control today? What is one thing that I know I can do today that's going to help me feel better? We can feel so overwhelmed and like we have no control, but just reminding ourselves there are small things that we can control and putting some energy into that too. Grief and loss are another experience that impacts our sense of adaptation and strength and resilience. And I just really want to normalize that grief belongs here. It is a very normal and natural response to losing something that we love. And it's also really normal to oscillate between avoiding feelings of grief and confronting feelings of grief. And that is very normal that you might be going between those things. And I think it just speaks to needing support to bear the intensity of grief sometimes. I included a small image here, and I'll just share the point I wanted to make is that we know that the brain is affected by grief. And I don't want this to be labeled as bad. It just is. This is what happens. Our prefrontal cortex is underactive, so it can be harder to make decisions and harder to focus. It can be harder to regulate our emotions, so we might feel more emotional. And I was talking before about that fight or flight center of the brain, that amygdala. It can be overactive, so we can react with that stress response more easily. And again, these are just elements of grief that are thought to be very protective for us and intelligent in our coping. You know, by nature, grief itself is adaptive. And so in its nature, grief is resilient. And I know it can feel really overwhelming, but we do know that there are certain healing milestones in grief and also certain derailers in our grief. The healing milestones might include really honoring yourself and finding ways to honor the person in this time or the things that they've loved in the past, creating new rituals, connecting with other people around this who understand. And some derailers in our grief that make it feel harder is this feeling that we haven't done enough, doubting yourself, thinking that you can control the grief, imagining scenarios where this never happened, and rejecting support. So those are things that also harm us in our experience of grief. Another experience that can interfere with our adaptation is guilt. There's such a thing as realistic guilt, where we did something and it may have harmed someone else and we feel bad about it. But there's also this very powerful, unrealistic self-blame that appears when we didn't really do anything that's wrong. And we might even be blaming ourselves for things that we have no control over. And it's really easy to confuse the experience of guilt with regret. Regret is when we identify the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, the things that we would have done differently if only we knew now what we knew then. And this just adds to the stress of caregiving and creates doubt that you've done enough when we know you've done so much. I think also guilt can contribute to this feeling that we have to do more to compensate for how badly we feel, when in fact, again, you've done nothing wrong. But it's so normal that we try to overcompensate for these feelings of guilt. So I wanted to reflect a little bit more on some of the things that might cultivate a resilience practice or an adaptation practice in living with FTD. I know that none of these are going to take away the pain of this time, but maybe ease the journey through. And one of those first things would be giving yourself permission to feel all of these difficult feelings. They are allowed and they belong, and they're both, and you're allowed to feel both grieving and grateful. You're allowed to feel longing and surrender at the same time. They coexist. And I really think it's important to listen to what these emotions are telling you need. Your grief deserves attention, and your mood and your mental health and mental well-being need attention. And so listen to that and find support around that if that's something you need. I think also the idea of acceptance, that things will not be the same. And this is understanding that if we try to keep things normal after normal is long gone, we only become frustrated. And then that interferes with our ability to cope. And keeping in mind that acceptance is not resignation. It's not being okay with what it is. It is a very strong response to an unchangeable situation. If you feel you're in this tug of war between what you wanted life to be and the disease, think about dropping that rope, allowing this to just be what it is instead of trying to hold on and fight, which is only going to exhaust you. And you may be even able to find some peace in that acceptance. I also talked before about being aware of the bias and the self-talk and the story that you might be telling yourself, and challenging those if you can notice those things, because they, while they're there, they don't always serve us. And so we want to be aware that those things might be taking place. Ditching the guilt, ditching the expectations of ourselves and other people, and maybe replacing those with compassion for ourselves, being kinder to ourselves, saying to ourselves what we would say to a friend. Think about what you'd say to a friend in some of these difficult moments that you've faced, and say that to yourself. And also having gratitude for yourselves and for the things that are going okay right now. And I think finally saying yes to help, and yes to support, and yes to support around your mental health, and saying no to things that you can't take on right now. That's okay too. I know I've covered a lot today, but if you take away one more thing, it's really that your mental health matters. And if you are not feeling like you can cope, you cannot be expected to be resilient. And so your mental health really is a priority. I also want to acknowledge that you are expressing the most profound act of love, and it's really something to be honored. And we have to continue to challenge this notion and the expectation that you alone need to be resilient, and not allow efforts to be resilient come at the cost of your emotional and spiritual well-being. So I hope that you can listen to what resilience means to you in this time, and keep talking about it so that we can redefine it together as a community. Recognize what you need, make it personal, make this definition personal to yourself too. Recognize what you need in order to see the deepest reserves of love and strength in this time. So I wanted to end together today with asking all of you to share any mantras or words of wisdom that you tell yourself in difficult times. I've included some here just to get things going, but I would love for all of you to share and take away from this session just some reflections that help you in the most difficult moments. The first one I'll include here is an acronym. It stands for, it's INHID is how it's pronounced, but it really stands for a mantra that a caregiver shared with me many years ago. It's not him, it's the damn disease. And she would tell herself over and over to remind herself that he's not doing these things on purpose, that this is the disease. So I'll take a moment to go into the chat, and I would love if there's any wisdom you would share there. One day at a time. After the dark comes the light. I'll feel better later. I always do. Feeling like Wonder Woman. These are really beautiful. Prayer. Yes. Quit taking it personally. I like that one. I hope these ideas are also helpful to those of you who don't yet have a mantra or something that you say to yourself, a prayer or a reflection that you have. I hope you can take some of these ideas away today, this wonderful wisdom. Broken crayons still color. I hope we can save these.
So Mary, I'm just going to jump in,
Yeah.
and I know we have just a few moments left. So first and foremost, thank you so much for such a great presentation. And folks, if you wanted to continue to use the chat too with those mantras, we will be saving those, Mary, just so that you know that you can have those. And I think we have time for just a few questions. So we have some already in the queue, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat now. And I think the first one that came through is that this person's saying that they've never been good at coping and sometimes get so upset or overwhelmed that they throw things or say things that maybe they later regret to either their loved one or a family member or a friend, or even maybe professionals that are involved in their care. And so how could this person learn how to better cope when they can't get past the overwhelming feeling that this caregiving role is kind of never ending? So if you have any thoughts or kind of advice based on that resilience from that perspective.
I think it's such a common experience, and I really want to normalize that. And I think one place to begin would really be to understand what are these emotions, what are these behaviors telling you? If we could turn the page on those behaviors and look at what is this telling you need right now? Maybe this is saying that you're doing too much. Maybe this is telling you that you need more help and that you can't be doing this alone, and that that's okay. But I think there is wisdom in our strongest emotions, and we need to really understand what they're telling us we need. I would also, every person is so different, but if you haven't yet been to a support group, I would really encourage that. I know we're all online right now, but that makes it a little even more accessible for everyone to come. But I think talking about those feelings in the support group would be really helpful. And don't forget that individual mental health support is also an option if you're feeling really overwhelmed, and if you need support in learning how to manage some of those really powerful feelings.
And you mentioned the support groups and potentially, some outside resources. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions about how to find a therapist or someone that knows about FTD?
It can be a challenge to find someone who knows the disease really well. I would first ask your neurologist if they know anyone who might be able to offer this type of support and really has an understanding of FTD and PPA. I think in some scenarios where those resources aren't as local or as easy to find, knowing that you might find a therapist who's a good fit, who then you educate about the disease and you bring some material so that they understand the disease. I think it would be important that it would be someone who understands grief and loss and ambiguous loss, because that is such a big part of this experience and those very confusing emotions.
Thanks, Mary. And I'll just add from AFTD's perspective on those list of resources, and if someone wouldn't mind just putting it in the chat again, either Anne or Corey, but one of them is a provider letter, and that can really go a long way in getting the person up to speed on where to find more resources about FTD and do their own homework for the therapist. And if they know about dementia and grief, it won't take a lot for that professional to kind of get up to speed on this experience, but it will take something, and that's a really good starting place for that.
Great.
And then the other thing that you had shared, another question that came through was information about how our brains are really wired to put ourselves down and not experience all the ways that I'm really doing a good job in my caregiving role, or not believe it when others tell me that I'm doing that. So if I have maybe less than 2 minutes a day to myself, what would be a beginning point for trying to work against that instinct that you could recommend, or something that could help with a starting place for folks that maybe haven't thought about that before or have done something like that before?
If there's a way to anchor this practice of looking for the things that are going okay, or one thing to be grateful for, or one thing that went well, I think whether it's with your tea in the morning or when you sit down to dinner, to anchor it to something you're already doing would be a really simple way of beginning. But I also think that recognizing what really matters to you in this time, what you value most, and what the person you care for values most, can help kind of take away some of the noise and the overwhelming feelings of this time. And to revisit that on an ongoing basis, because that can change for each of us in different circumstances, but really have a conversation with yourself and the person or others in your family of what is most important right now. The caring can get really overwhelming, and I just want to continue to have a compass that guides me based on what matters most to our family and what matters most to the person with the illness. And I think just thinking about it and breaking it down in that sense can be really helpful for people, and to check back with those values on an ongoing basis to say, are these decisions we're making, or is me getting overwhelmed, in line with what I value right now, and what needs to change in order for me to reconnect with that.
Great, Mary. Well, thank you so much. And I think we are just about out of time for our breakout today. I know it felt like it flew by with all of the helpful information that Mary had. So please help me in thanking Mary for this presentation. If you're able to either unmute yourself or show your camera, or just do a reaction in Zoom, but just I'm going to take a moment to say thank you. And so clapping or however that needs to work would be great. And before we leave, we're going to
thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.
Appreciate you.
Mary. Thank you.
Hallelujah.
Thank you.
That was most helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Mary.
everyone.
Thank you,
It's
Mary.
awesome.
Thanks, Mary. That was great.
We appreciate you.
Thank
So
you.
we're just going to
Mary.
take a minute or two.
so much.
We'll automatically end
appreciate
the breakout
you.
session and return to the main conference for the rest of the day's session. So again, we'll leave this breakout in just a moment. So just thank you for attending and for listening to all of the wise words that Mary had. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the afternoon and the presentations that are coming through today and tomorrow. But Mary, thank you again so much. We so appreciate all that you've done and for this presentation and all that you bring to our families that are affected on the journey. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Yes.
Yes.